When I decided to share the ups and downs of my experience trying to reach 1 million people through writing and speaking, I promised to be honest. And yeah, this week I'm going to do that. I talked about sharing ups and downs, and last week was a down. It was definitely a down week. And it's because my brain got hijacked by a 7-year-old show on Netflix, and I genuinely did not see it coming. And that doesn't mean that it was new to me. It actually felt very familiar, but I have to be careful. It was a really good reminder how I am a person who struggles to follow through with my own internal commitments. I find it much easier to keep my external commitments, but if I just say, "Hey, you got to be careful because you need to stay on track," that is really hard for me to do alone. Also, if you are new here, welcome. I am Kat, and on this podcast, I am sharing behind the scenes as I try real time experiments to help me to follow through on what matters and find momentum as a speaker and a writer. And last week, things fell off the rails. Now, as to what happened, for a long time, a friend of mine had been talking about a show that she absolutely loved. Shout out to Heather. Well, we're going to see if this is going to be a shout out or not, because what started as a simple, oh, that might be a nice show that I can watch while I'm cycling at home on my stationary cycle. Well, that's how it started, and then it very quickly turned into me walking around the house with my iPad, watching this show during every spare moment I could get. And it slowly slipped into creeping into my work. Things started to pile up, and then I actually experienced a crash, which is kind of ironic because the show is a 2019 Korean drama called Crash Landing on You. It got its hooks in me and just would not let go, and I share this story because I have absolutely had this happen to me on multiple occasions, and the times where I've struggled the most is when I'm the only person at the helm. In other words, university, this used to happen, although thank goodness that looking back, DVD sets weren't even that popular yet when I was in university. So it was harder to have this happen. Now, in the age of everything is accessible at your fingertips, it's so easy to get hooked into consuming, say, a show, a series, or something like that. And when this happens, if there's no one else that I'm responsible to, like in university or like right now, where I am my own boss, it is so much more difficult compared to times where I was employed, had more structure, had bosses to report to. I had to show up at work and I couldn't just be sitting there binging. And but I want to share about it because what actually happened is I kept my external appointments, things that were in my calendar. I would absolutely show up to those. For example, a week ago, recording this podcast, I showed up, I did the podcast, I recorded it all. And then when I had lunch, I started watching the show again because I was hooked. And after lunch, I thought, well, you know what? I need to decompress. I'm just going to watch one more episode and then I'll go back to work, which turned into 2 episodes. And I finally got back to work prepping my podcast and actually getting it ready to publish when my spouse came home. And I realized, oh my God, I've just spent the entire afternoon watching this show and I need to get back to work. And then that's when I start to negotiate, where I start to think to myself, okay, how about if I just take the next half day and just get through the rest of it, and then it's just kind of small pain and I can get back on track. It's this negotiation that I start to have in my head of I will just shirk all my responsibilities for a while and then I'm fine. And I managed to not totally do that. I paced myself. I even, didn't just spend the entire night watching the show. However, the next day, as some of my responsibilities and commitments did start to pile, the things that I was in control over the timing, that's when I hit a tipping point, and that's where things fell off the rails. Now, when I say fall off the rails, I mean emotionally, sort of the burden of the fact that things are piling and I am falling behind and I am feeling guilty and I'm also just feeling out of control. And so when all of those things happen, that's where I start to just kinda have, like, a mini meltdown. And so on Thursday evening last week, that's when things kinda hit a wall where I got an email about something that I did not realize I was responsible for. It's personal. In my personal life, I'm responsible for an estate for a family member, and I got an email that I was not expecting, and that just put me over the edge, where I just kind of melted down and fell into a bit of a puddle. And I couldn't, it's like I stopped functioning. And that can happen when I get really overwhelmed. But it's one thing to be overwhelmed just because you have a lot going on. It's another thing to be overwhelmed because of your own inability to stop consuming a show that is just addictive. It feels like there's just a bigger layer of judgment that's going on. Now, I recognize that this is actually an over a compulsive overconsumption. And that's something, if you haven't read it or if you're not familiar, Anna Lemke has Dopamine Nation, which is a book that explains this and how we are in a culture where everything's at our fingertips as soon as we want it. And so it reminded me of that around this compulsive overconsumption that can happen very easily, where it is a neurochemical reaction that is happening in our brain. And we can start to feel a little bit of helplessness against it. And there are things you can do, absolutely. But I also know that the way that I'm wired makes me more prone than other people to fall victim to this. And I was not initially thrilled about the idea of sharing this story because I am embarrassed, frankly, but I don't think I should be because I talked to a few trusted friends last week, told them straight up what was happening, that I felt like I was a monster and could not stop. And and then people were just saying, "Oh, I feel that. This happened to me when." And this I had that experience. And when a friend said to me, "Well, how do you stop it?" I was floored by the question because I realized that the way this usually stops is when I kind of have that meltdown crash where I just actually stop functioning properly and I need an intervention. And luckily, I do have support for trying to help me with that. But the other way is when I do have these outside commitments that are stronger and that I want to keep and they're more important. And then that gives me the structure of saying, you can't just watch this show all day or binge this series or read this book or whatever insert the thing is that's got its hooks in me. But it usually needs to be external. It's either external or I crash and I admit I cannot keep doing this. Now, in the book Dopamine Nation, Dr. Lemke does talk about this idea of self binding. And actually, it's very timely because in the Odyssey, there's the example of this siren call and how Odysseus actually ties himself to the mast and everyone else just has beeswax. It's kind of like that, and there are different ways that you can use what's called self-binding. So whether that is actually deleting apps off your phone, restricting access, having someone else have a password so that you're signed out. Luckily, in this case, I think because I started to have a mini meltdown last week, I was able to say, I gotta slow down. I This show is 7 years old. I have been hearing about it for months from my friend, and it's still gonna be there in a few days. And I was able to actually sort of regroup, but it's almost like I got bonked on the head and was able to see what exactly was happening. And that's when I was able to step in a little bit more calmly, but also having discussed it with people close to me and recognizing this is not cool. This is having negative impacts. You need to focus on the things that are going to alleviate some of that stress, meaning deal with some of the backlog that has been building, and I was able to do that really well on Friday. I set in place rules like you can't start watching it while you're eating breakfast because I literally was getting up and I was had my iPad going all through breakfast, all through lunch, and then as soon as I had free moments, I was finding myself back on Netflix. The other kicker that I'll just explain here is it is a Korean drama that is all subtitles. So it's not exactly something that you can just have on and hear in the background. I do not understand Korean. I had to be looking at the screen. And I'm not kidding you when I say I was walking around with my iPad in my hand looking at the screen, which is probably physically dangerous. But even something like trying to prep, like making breakfast, I would sometimes pause so that I could see what I was doing and then go back to watching it. However, I mean, it's not a great thing. Drying your hair, you can actually watch subtitles really easily while you have the hair dryer, which normally I wouldn't watch TV while I'm drying my hair. But so this is the level, just so that you can understand how much this got its hooks in me. The other thing is that it's 16 episodes, but these are not 20-minute episodes. They're not 40 minutes episodes. They're not even an hour. They're all around an hour, 20 minutes. So this was a very big commitment. I'm pleased to say that I was able to step away from it all day Friday and all day Saturday, and then came back and was able to slowly finish the series on Sunday on a weekend. And one of the things I did was actually have structured things I had to do in between. So I would watch an episode and then do laundry, and then watch an episode and then I clean the bathroom, and then watch an episode. And actually, I think I only had 3 left on Sunday. So I was able to pace myself, but I did it in a way where I had to be so intentional. I had to share my plan. I'm going to watch and then I'm going to do something productive. And that was me slowing down the train. And I use a train analogy where it feels like someone has just come into the train and taken over, and it's just going faster and faster until it falls off the tracks, which is what happened on Thursday. And what I have to do in those moments is to just really slow it down, let someone else maybe help me to guide it, and just really, really calm things down. Now, when it comes to my actual business, some of the things that happened is that I did not do all of the things that I said I would do, which is a very common thing. And that's one of the reasons that I even share my real life experience on this podcast, is because if I'm the only one who's accountable, it's easy for me to push it off. But last week I noticed there were even things accountable to other people that I was delayed on. They still got done eventually, but not on the timeline I liked. And that is something that I really struggled with. And I think that's part of this mini kind of meltdown or crash that I had on Thursday, of just recognizing how much I was derailed and I was off the tracks. And I had shared with a couple of friends how much I was enjoying this. And when they offered new suggestions, I just said, please do not tell me more suggestions, or I am not going to start. Or if you tell me something, it needs to be paceable. And in one case, my friend Heather, who recommended it, actually said, what if we do a watch together where it's 2 episodes a week? And that is something I could easily do, say over a lunch hour or while I'm cycling or something like that, that feels like a better pace. And if there's another person that's pacing with me, it is much easier for me to actually kind of pump the brakes, slow down, and not have it completely derail me. But this is a true threat if you are wired like me, but also self-employed, where it's just easier to quote unquote get away with it. But it was problematic. And so on that note, I do want to share my tracker. So I have been tracking my progress, and let's take a look, but it's actually not very different from last week's numbers because of this down week that I had. So when it comes to my monthly tracking with posting for the month, I have 8 posts out of my goal of 20. So I'm at 40%, and it is the day I'm recording. It's the 19th. There's not a lot of the month left. So I don't know realistically if this will happen or not. I am going to keep posting, but obviously the derailment hurt me a little bit. Outreach is probably where it got hurt the most. I have actually only outreached to 7 out of 40. However, I am going to share that I think I am going to hit this goal, because I did take time during this week's co-working session. I couldn't attend the whole thing because I had a client call. However, I was able to make a list of, I think, around 50 people that I will be reaching out to about an upcoming workshop. And I debated, does this count as outreach? Because I'm not necessarily connecting about an opportunity for speaking. But then I realized, actually, no, this is part of the outreach and networking. And it is about one of the workshops that I run. So this is about the Immunity to Change workshop. I'm going to be hosting a live workshop on September 3rd. And I want to make sure that people know about it, whether they have experienced it or not. And I recognize that this is also a reminder that, hey, I run these and I can run these for teams and groups, etc. So I do actually think that I'm going to count it. I'm my own boss and I get to count outreach where people are becoming aware of some of the speaking engagements that they could attend, but also what's possible for me to do with other groups. The outreach results, I did record a podcast last week on Friday, so that counts as another appearance. I've got 2 appearances for August. My booked speaking gigs is at 3, and then the final number that I'm keeping track of is my sort of outcome tracker, where I look at audience members I spoke to. So it's at 13 after doing a talk last week, and subscribers for August right now are at 39. Full disclosure though, this is only counting people who have subscribed since the start of August. And I recognize that that might not reflect people who might have left the list, which is a completely normal thing to happen. And I want to make sure that I allow for, like, I want realistic numbers because you can lose people when you are communicating. And so I need to figure out a way. I want that to be a net new number. So I'll figure out what that looks like so that when I share those numbers, they are the real numbers that reflect how many people are on the list, not just adding everyone who joins and never reflecting people who might say, you know what, I'm good, bye. And I did notice that happened earlier this week. I had promoted an appearance that I am doing tomorrow, or if you were listening on the day this comes out, today. And I'm partnering with Senja, the testimonial software that I use to run a webinar. And we're talking about procrastinating. And I'll specifically be telling my story about how I put off collecting testimonials for almost 2 years. And when I promoted that, I did notice there were a few people dropping off the list, which is completely fine. Unsubscribes are normal, they are part of business. But that did happen, which when I logged in today and I looked at the total number, but the new subscribers, that's where I realized, okay, I need to have a way to reflect this. So that's something that I am going to do. But I think that this recent experience has been a cautionary reminder for me of trying to notice early once I start to see the pattern creeping in where I am wanting to sort of shirk my responsibilities, where I'm wanting to step away from work during the day in order to consume something that has nothing to do with work. And even consuming things that are work related can be a slippery slope of, oh, I'm going to watch this YouTube video about something for my business, or I'm going to listen to this business podcast. Those also can be problematic with having things to fall behind. So I do like to have guardrails on what I am willing and not willing to do. I also have a rule, generally speaking, that is you cannot sit on the couch during the work day. And unless you're actually doing work, and only this couch. So basically the living room is off limits to me during the workday. But last week I sat down, I broke the rule, but it's like, as I said, someone else had hijacked my brain and took over. And I, yeah, paid the consequences of it. The other thing is just to remember that I do work better when there are external commitments and external people supporting me, and that my brain is wired to be more susceptible to it. And also not to beat myself up when it happens, but to ask for help as soon as I notice it's happening, instead of trying to do the internal negotiation, trying to hide it, minimize it, or say, oh, well, I'll just pause everything until I finish this, because that's faulty thinking, unhelpful things that are just going to make the situation worse. And actually, it does remind me a book that I was recently reading, which is How to Try Again by Steve Cam. I think I got the title right, and if I didn't, I apologize to Steve. But it is this idea of using the PACT formula. So pause, accept, C is for change, and then try. And the pause is around noticing that something is not working and not make it worse. And that to me is actually a really big key here, is don't make it worse. And I think that there are times when you're in that negotiation spiral where I'll say, oh, if I can just finish all of it, then I'll be on the other side, and that would actually make it worse. And so, in a way, I did that last week, but I kinda did it because I was forced to, because I just started to crash. And that is not a pun because of the show being called Crash Landing on You. And also I feel torn because I want to recommend this show to people who might like it, but I also maybe just go in knowing you need some boundaries if what I shared is similar, because man, that show just it got its hooks in me. Not to say that I regret watching it because I did love it. I just wish maybe I had paced it a little bit more and also reminded myself that the show has been on Netflix for a long time and it's still going to be there and it's not going anywhere. And actually, if you pace yourself, then you get to enjoy it over a longer period. But as Dr. Lemke in Dopamine Nation reminds us, it's very hard to step away when that seesaw of our pain and pleasure is out of alignment. It can be really hard to actually just stop things because it's actually painful in your brain. All right. I would love to hear in the comments if you do have any advice or what works for you when you notice you're on a train that is kind of running away and derailing you. What works for you? Are there any other tips and tricks? Because I am open to them. I am 100% open to hearing what you have to say. And I will continue to share the ups and the downs. And hopefully, I won't have too many of these updates because I'll be able to catch them early. But if it happens, I'll share it here on the Momentum Experiment as I try to figure out how to reach 1 million people through my speaking and writing and finding my momentum.